On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a crop duster pilot named Mitch Calloway stood beside his Grumman Ag Cat on the tarmac of a small airstrip outside Stafford County, Kansas, and watched his entire autumn season dissolve into something he could not fix. The Magneto had gone. Not degraded, not misfiring, not throwing a code that some diagnostic computer could read and interpret. Gone. The kind of failure that happens at the molecular level, where the internal timing and the winding and the points and the condenser all conspire together at once, and the engine simply refuses to fire. He had 300 acres of winter wheat to treat before the first hard frost. He had a contract worth $11,000 sitting in his glove box, and he had a Magneto that was, by every measure available to him, dead. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the story of Mitch Calloway's Magneto is not really about Mitch Calloway. It is about the man who fixed it, and the 11 men who came before Mitch, and the 17 who came after, and what happened to all of them when the last rebuilder in Stafford County finally closed his shop door for good. Let me tell you about the world Mitch Calloway lived and worked inside, because you need to understand it before you can understand why a burned Magneto in October of 1987 was not merely an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe measured in hours. Crop dusting in the Kansas plains operated on a calendar so tight it had no slack in it whatsoever. The window between the moment a field needed treatment and the moment it was too late to treat was sometimes measured in days, sometimes in a single day. The pilots who flew those routes knew this the way a surgeon knows the difference between a nick and a severed artery. Not as information, but as a physical sensation in the chest. When Mitch's Magneto failed on that Tuesday morning, he did not call his distributor in Wichita first. He called every mechanic within 60 miles. He called the airframe and power plant shop in Pratt. He called a man in Hutchinson who sometimes dealt in used aircraft parts. He called the regional Lycoming representative, whose number he had memorized the way other men memorize their children's birthdays. Every one of them told him the same thing in different words. A rebuilt Magneto for that engine, sourced, tested, and shipped, was going to take between 8 and 12 days. The season would be over. The contract would be forfeit. $11,000 gone. That's when someone told him about Delmar Hassel. Let me tell you about Delmar Hassel, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did and what it meant, and why 31 pilots and mechanics and farmers and crop dusters drove to his gate over 12 years and left their burned Magnetos like offerings at a shrine. Delmar was 61 years old in October of 1987. He had spent his working life in a corrugated metal shop on the east side of his property on County Road 14, about 7 miles outside the town of St. John, Kansas, in a building that had no sign on it, no listed phone number in the directory, and no indication from the road that anything of value was happening inside. He had inherited the shop from his father, Clement Hassel, who had built it in 1941 using lumber salvaged from a collapsed grain elevator and corrugated tin. He bought second-hand from a farm supply company that was going out of business. Clement had been an aircraft mechanic during the war, trained on radial engines at Chanute Field in Illinois, and when he came home to Stafford County in 1946, he brought with him a working knowledge of magneto systems that was, even then, becoming rare. He had understood magnetos not as components to be replaced when they failed, but as systems to be understood, rebuilt, and returned to service. He had passed this understanding to Delmar the way other fathers pass down the family Bible or the deed to the land. not as instruction, but as inheritance. Delmar had been rebuilding aircraft Magnetos since he was 19 years old. By 1987, that was 42 years of accumulated knowledge sitting inside a corrugated metal building with no sign on it, surrounded by parts bins and test equipment, and a wooden workbench his father had built in 1947 that still had the original vise bolted to it. He kept a slick magneto test stand that dated from the early 1950s. He had drawers full of point sets and condensers and coils and drive couplings, sourced over decades from surplus dealers and salvage yards and the estates of other mechanics who had retired or died. He did not advertise. He did not need to. The people who needed him found him the way people in small communities always find the person who can do something nobody else can do, through the quiet, reliable infrastructure of word of mouth. Someone told someone, who told someone else, and eventually a burned magneto ended up at his gate. Mitch Calloway ended up at that gate on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a slick 4300 series magneto that had shorted internally and smelled faintly of burned insulation. He had driven the 7 miles from the airstrip with the magneto wrapped in a shop rag on the passenger seat of his truck, feeling the particular desperation of a man watching money evaporate in real time. Delmar met him at the gate, not because he had been called, but because he had heard the truck coming down the gravel road and stepped outside to see who it was. He was wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and a seed cap that had the name of an implement dealer on it that had gone out of business in 1979. He looked at Mitch. He looked at the shop rag. He said, "Bring it inside." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What does it mean to understand a thing so completely that you can fix it when everyone else has given up? Not diagnose it. Not replace it. Fix it. There's a difference between a mechanic who knows which part to order and a mechanic who knows why the part failed, what conditions produced the failure, and how to address those conditions so the failure does not recur. Delmar Hassel was the second kind. He had been the second kind for 42 years, and in October of 1987, there were almost none of him left. Let me tell you about the magneto itself, because you need to understand what Delmar was working with before you can understand what he was doing. A magneto is a self-contained electrical generator that produces the ignition spark for a piston aircraft engine. Unlike a car engine, which relies on the vehicle's battery and alternator to power its ignition system, an aircraft magneto generates its own electricity through the rotation of a permanent magnet past a set of coils. This makes it independent of the aircraft's electrical system, which is why aircraft engines have two of them, left and right, so that if one fails, the other continues firing. The magneto contains a rotor, a set of breaker points, a condenser, a primary coil, a secondary coil, and a distributor that routes the high-voltage spark to the correct cylinder at the correct moment in the engine's cycle. When any one of these components fails, when the points burn or pit, when the condenser shorts, when the coil insulation breaks down from heat and vibration, the magneto stops producing reliable spark. The engine runs rough or not at all. In a crop duster flying at low altitude over a Kansas wheat field, a magneto failure is not an inconvenience. It is an emergency. Mitch's magneto had suffered a condenser failure that had allowed the points to arc and burn, which had in turn damaged the primary coil winding. To an average mechanic in 1987, this was a parts replacement problem. And since the parts had a lead time of 8 to 12 days, the problem was unsolvable in the short term. To Delmar Hassel, it was a rebuilding problem. He had condensers in a parts bin that he had sourced from a Magneto overhaul shop in Tulsa that had closed in 1974. He had point sets in another bin. He had primary coil stock that he wound himself on a form his father had machined from aluminum bar stock sometime in the early 1950s. He sat down at the wooden workbench under a single fluorescent light, and he began to work. Mitch asked him how long it would take. Delmar said, "Come back Thursday." Mitch said he needed it by Wednesday morning at the latest. Delmar looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come back tomorrow morning." Mitch came back Wednesday morning. The Magneto was sitting on the bench, rebuilt, tested on the slick test stand, timed, and wrapped in a clean shop rag. Delmar had replaced the condenser, dressed and reset the points, rewound the primary coil, and tested the output voltage and spark timing against the manufacturer's specification. He handed it to Mitch and told him the timing setting and the gap specification and what to watch for on the next annual inspection. He charged him $40. Mitch Calloway flew his 300 acres of winter wheat that Wednesday. He completed the contract. He kept the $11,000. And on his way back to the airstrip that afternoon, he stopped at a payphone and called every pilot and mechanic he knew in a 60-mile radius, and told them about the man on County Road 14 with no sign on his shop and a 42-year-old workbench and a parts bin full of condensers that nobody else in Kansas seemed to have anymore. Let me tell you about the 12 years that followed, because they are the heart of this story, and they do not belong to Mitch Calloway alone. Between October of 1987 and the spring of 1999, 31 separate aircraft owners, pilots, mechanics, and farm operators brought Magnetos to Delmar Hassel's shop on County Road 14. Not all of them were emergencies. Some of them were annual overhauls that the owner preferred to have done by someone who understood the work rather than someone who merely processed it. Some of them were failures that had been sitting in a box for months, because the owner had already been told by 2 or 3 other shops that the Magneto was beyond economic repair and should be replaced with a new unit, and the owner had not yet accepted this verdict. Some of them were brought by men who had never met Delmar but had heard his name, passed down through a chain of referrals so long that by the time the Magneto arrived at his gate, nobody quite remembered who had first mentioned him. Let me tell you about a few of them, because the Magnetos tell the story better than any summary can. In the spring of 1989, a man named Vernon Borgman drove from Pratt County with a Bendix S6RN Magneto that had come off a Beechcraft Bonanza. 3 shops had told him it was scrap. The internal rotor had cracked at the shaft, which was a failure mode that most rebuilders considered terminal. The rotor was a precision component, and sourcing a replacement for a Magneto of that vintage was considered impractical. Delmar looked at it for about 2 minutes. Then he went to a parts bin in the back corner of the shop that Vernon had not noticed, and came back with a rotor that had come off a Magneto he had purchased from an estate sale in 1981, purely because he recognized the rotor as being in good condition. He had kept it for 8 years. It fit. He rebuilt the Magneto and charged Vernon $65. Vernon drove home with a Magneto that 3 shops had called scrap, and that was now, by every measurable standard, airworthy. In the summer of 1991, a crop duster operation out of Kingman County sent a mechanic named Dale Sievert to County Road 14 with 4 Magnetos in a cardboard box, all of them pulled from a pair of Grumman Ag Cats that were due for their annual inspection. Sievert had been told by the regional slick distributor that 3 of the 4 were candidates for replacement rather than overhaul, based on the condition of the coil insulation and the degree of point wear. He brought them to Delmar as a last option before ordering new units at roughly $350 apiece. Delmar rebuilt all four. He charged $200 for the set. Sievert drove back to Kingman County with 4 airworthy Magnetos in the same cardboard box, having spent $200 instead of over $1,000. He told his boss. His boss told 2 other operators. By the following spring, Delmar had rebuilt 9 more Magnetos for operations out of Kingman, Pratt, and Reno counties. In the winter of 1993, a retired Air Force mechanic named Harlan Peterson brought a Magneto from a 1946 Stearman biplane that he was restoring in his garage in McPherson County. The Magneto was an Easeman GV4, a model that had not been in production since the late 1940s, and for which no new replacement parts had been commercially available for decades. Harlan had been told by 2 aircraft restoration specialists in Wichita that the Magneto was a display piece, that it might be cleaned up and mounted on a wall, but that it would never again fire an engine. Delmar looked at it for a long time. He asked Harlan to leave it with him. 3 weeks later, Harlan got a phone call. Delmar did not have a listed number, but he had Harlan's number from the slip of paper Harlan had left with the Magneto. The call was brief. Delmar said the Magneto was ready. Harlan drove out and found the Easeman sitting on the bench, rebuilt to a standard that Harlan, who had 30 years of aircraft maintenance experience, described afterward as better than factory. Delmar had fabricated 2 internal components from raw stock. He had rewound the secondary coil by hand. He had machined a new distributor block from phenolic rod on a small metal lathe that sat in the corner of the shop and that Harlan had not noticed on his first visit. Delmar charged him $90. Harlan's Stearman flew the following summer. He sent Delmar a photograph of it in the air, and Delmar tacked it to the wall above his workbench, where it stayed until the day he closed the shop. Now let me pause here and ask you something. How many Delmar Hassels were there in 1987? How many are there now? The answer to the first question is not many. The answer to the second question is almost none. The knowledge that Delmar carried, the ability to rebuild a Magneto from components, to fabricate what could not be sourced, to understand the failure modes and the tolerances and the interaction between the points and the condenser and the coil at a level that allowed genuine repair rather than replacement. That knowledge had been dying since the 1960s. The economics of aviation maintenance had shifted toward replacement rather than repair. New Magnetos became cheaper, relatively speaking. Overhauled exchange units became available through distributors. The FAA's regulatory framework, while not prohibiting repair, created paperwork and liability structures that made it easier for shops to replace than to rebuild. And the men who had learned to rebuild, who had learned it the way Clement Hassel learned it at Chanute Field, through years of hands-on work with the actual components. Those men retired and died and were not replaced. Their knowledge did not transfer. It simply ended, the way a language ends when the last native speaker dies. Delmar knew this. He had known it for years. He was not bitter about it exactly, but he was clear-eyed about what it meant. He had tried, twice, to teach what he knew to younger mechanics who had expressed interest. The first man had lasted 3 months before taking a job at a turbine overhaul shop in Wichita that paid 3 times what Delmar could offer. The second had been genuinely talented, but had moved to Colorado with his wife in 1985 and had not continued the work. Delmar had no children. The workbench his father had built in 1947 would outlast the knowledge it had supported. Let me tell you about the spring of 1999, because that is when everything changed. and not in the direction anyone who had been bringing Magnetos to County Road 14 would have wished. Delmar Hassel turned 73 in February of 1999. By March, the arthritis in his hands had reached a point where the fine work, the coil winding, the point setting, the condenser installation, had become not merely difficult, but unreliable. He could still do it. But he could not do it with the consistency that airworthy work required. He understood this with the same clarity he brought to everything else. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not gradually reduce his standards to accommodate his hands. He sat down one morning in March, looked at the workbench his father had built, looked at the parts bins and the test stand and the lathe in the corner, and made the decision that a man of genuine integrity makes when his body can no longer support his standard of work. He closed the shop. He did not announce it widely. He made phone calls to the people he had worked with most regularly: Mitch Callaway, Vernon Borgman, the operations manager at the Kingman County Crop Dusting Company, Harlan Peterson, and a dozen others. He told them what he was doing and why. He told them he was sorry he could not recommend anyone to take over the work because there was no one he knew of who could do it to the standard it required. He told them to take care of their Magnetos, to overhaul on schedule rather than waiting for failure, and to be careful about who they trusted with the work. Then he locked the shop door. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story does not end with the locked door. It continues, and the continuation is instructive in ways that are uncomfortable to sit with. In the summer of 1999, 3 months after Delmar closed his shop, Mitch Callaway had a magneto failure during a flight over a wheat field in Reno County. It was the right magneto on his ag cat, and the failure was partial, a points issue that caused intermittent misfiring rather than complete stoppage. He landed safely. He pulled the magneto and drove it to the airframe shop in Pratt, which was the nearest facility with a certified magneto repair station. They told him the magneto was a candidate for overhaul exchange. They would take it in trade against a factory overhauled unit at $380. He paid the $380. He thought about the $40 he had paid in 1987. He did not say anything about it to the man behind the counter, because there was nothing useful to say. Vernon Borgman had a similar experience in the fall of 1999. The Bonanza's right magneto, not the one Delmar had rebuilt, which was still performing correctly, but the left one, which had developed a timing drift, went to a shop in Wichita. The shop recommended replacement. New magneto, installed and timed, $420. Vernon paid it. He thought about the $65 he had paid in 1989 for a magneto that 3 shops had called scrap. He thought about the rotor that Delmar had kept in a parts bin for 8 years because he recognized it as good. Harlan Peterson's Stearman needed magneto attention in 2001. The Eisenman G54 that Delmar had rebuilt, still performing, still timed correctly, still firing on every cylinder, needed only a points inspection and a condenser check. But Harlan could not find anyone willing to open it. Every shop he contacted either declined to work on a magneto of that vintage or quoted him a research and labor fee that exceeded the value of the entire aircraft. He ended up doing the inspection himself, carefully, using Delmar's instructions, which he had written down on a notepad during their conversations and kept in the same drawer as the aircraft's logbooks. The magneto was fine. It needed nothing. But Harlan spent 6 weeks trying to find out whether it needed anything, because the man who could have told him in 10 minutes was no longer available. Let me tell you about Dale Sievert, because Dale's story is the one that most clearly illustrates what was lost when Delmar Hassel locked his shop door. Dale had gone from being a mechanic at the Kingman County operation to owning his own small crop dusting business by 1999. 2 ag cats, a spray truck, 1,200 acres of contract work across 3 counties. When Delmar closed, Dale lost not just a Magneto rebuilder, but an advisor. Delmar had been the person Dale called when something was wrong that he couldn't diagnose. Not just Magnetos, but anything in the ignition system, anything that produced a rough-running engine or an unusual drop on the mag check. Delmar had a diagnostic instinct built from decades of seeing failures, and he shared it freely over the phone at no charge. Dale had called him 40 or 50 times over the years, with questions that had nothing to do with bringing a Magneto in for work. Now, those calls went to the Lycoming Technical Support Line, where the answer was almost always to bring the aircraft to an authorized service center. In 2001, Dale had a chronic rough-running issue on one of his ag cats that 3 different shops investigated over a period of 4 months without resolving. The problem was intermittent. It appeared on the run-up, disappeared in flight, returned on the run-up the following day. Each shop checked the Magnetos, found them within specification on the test stand, and released the aircraft. The problem persisted. Dale spent over $2,000 in diagnostic labor across those 4 months. He thought about Delmar constantly during that period. Not with anger, but with the specific grief of knowing that the person who could have solved the problem in an afternoon was sitting in a farmhouse on County Road 14 with hands that could no longer do the work. The problem was eventually traced to a cracked distributor block that was only cracking under the thermal conditions of the run-up and sealing itself as the engine cooled. It was exactly the kind of failure that Delmar would have suspected from the symptom description. It was exactly the kind of failure that required someone who understood the component at the level of its materials and its failure modes, not just its test stand output. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What is the actual cost of losing Delmar Hassel? Not the sentimental cost, not the cultural cost, but the dollars and hours cost to the men who had relied on him. Mitch Callaway, in the years between 1999 and 2005, spent an estimated $4,000 more on Magneto-related maintenance than he had spent in the equivalent period before Delmar closed. Not because his Magnetos failed more often, but because the replacement economics were so much worse than the rebuild economics had been. Dale Sievert's 4-month diagnostic odyssey cost him $2,000 in shop fees and an indeterminate amount in lost flying days. Vernon Borgman, who flew his Bonanza for pleasure rather than commerce, simply began deferring Magneto maintenance longer than he should have because the cost of proper attention had tripled. He knew this was wrong. He did it anyway because the alternative felt punishing. These are not dramatic numbers. They are the quiet, accumulated cost of a specific kind of knowledge leaving a specific community. Not all at once, not visibly, but steadily, the way a water table drops during a drought, invisible until the wells start going dry. Let me tell you about the shop on County Road 14, in the years after Delmar closed it because the building itself has something to say. Delmar did not sell the equipment. He did not liquidate the parts bins or the test stand or the lathe or the wooden workbench. He covered everything with canvas tarps and locked the door and left it. When people asked him why he didn't sell the parts, the condensers and coils and point sets that represented decades of sourcing and accumulation, he said he wasn't ready to make that decision yet. What he meant, though he did not say it in these words, was that he was not ready to accept that the knowledge those parts represented was truly finished. The parts without the knowledge were just parts, but the knowledge without the parts was nothing either. Together, they were something. Separately, they were inventory and memory, which are not the same thing. Harlan Peterson visited Delmar in the fall of 2003. They sat on the porch of the farmhouse and drank coffee and talked for most of an afternoon. Harlan asked Delmar if he had ever thought about writing down what he knew, a manual, a set of procedures, something that could be passed on. Delmar thought about it for a while. Then he said that what he knew was not the kind of thing that transferred well to paper. He said that the knowledge lived in the hands and the eyes, and in the accumulated experience of having seen 1,000 failures and understood what produced each one. He said you could write down the specifications, the gap settings, the timing figures, the test voltages, and those were already written down in the manufacturer's manuals. What you could not write down was the judgment, the ability to look at a set of points and know not just that they were worn, but why they had worn the way they had worn, and what that pattern of wear told you about the condenser and the coil and the way the engine had been operated. That was not a procedure. That was a language. And languages, he said, do not transfer to paper. They transfer to people, through years of working alongside someone who speaks them. Harlan drove home from that visit thinking about what Delmar had said. He thought about it for a long time afterward. He thought about the Isoman GV4 on his Stearman, still running, still timed, still firing on every cylinder, a piece of 1940s engineering that was airworthy because one man had kept the knowledge to make it so, and that would become progressively more difficult to maintain as that man's hands gave out and no one learned what his hands had known. Let me tell you about the fall of 2005, because that is when Delmar Hassel died, and because the manner of his death and the disposition of his shop tell you something important about how this kind of knowledge ends. He died in October, 6 years after closing the shop, of a heart attack in the farmhouse on County Road 14. He was 79 years old. He had spent the last 6 years of his life in the farmhouse and on the porch and in the garden and occasionally in the locked shop, where he sometimes went to sit among the covered equipment without doing anything in particular. The people who knew him said he seemed at peace with things, mostly, that he did not express regret about closing when he had, that he was clear-eyed, as he had always been, about what was and what was not possible. His estate went to a nephew in Colorado, who had no connection to aviation or farming, and who, when he came to settle the property, found the locked shop and the covered equipment and the parts bins, and did not know what he was looking at. He hired an estate liquidator. The liquidator, who specialized in farm equipment and household goods, did not recognize the slick test stand, or the coil winding form, or the parts bins full of condensers and point sets for aircraft Magnetos of vintage that had not been in production for 30 or 40 years. He priced them as general shop equipment and electrical parts. The wooden workbench that Clement Hassel had built in 1947 sold for $40 to a man who wanted it for his garage. The parts bins sold in lots. The test stand went to a man who collected vintage shop equipment and who, when told what it was, said he had never heard of it. The lathe went to a machinist in Wichita. The coil winding form, the aluminum form that Clement had machined in the early 1950s and that Delmar had used to rewind primary coils for 42 years, was not recognized as anything in particular and sold in a box of miscellaneous shop tooling for $12. Mitch Calloway heard about the estate sale after the fact. He drove out to County Road 14 and stood in the empty shop and looked at the bare walls and the empty bins and the workbench-shaped absence where the $40 bench had been. He stood there for a while. Then he drove home. Let me tell you about what the Magneto world looked like by 2010, because context matters here and the context is not encouraging. By 2010, the landscape of aircraft Magneto service had consolidated dramatically. The major manufacturers, Slick, Bendix, now owned and reorganized under various corporate structures, had moved increasingly toward a replace rather than rebuild model. Factory new Magnetos were available, and the regulatory and liability framework of aviation maintenance had made it progressively easier for shops to justify replacement over overhaul. The independent rebuilder, the man with a test stand and a parts bin and 40 years of knowledge, had become genuinely rare. Not extinct, but rare. The aviation maintenance technician schools were training mechanics to diagnose and replace, not to rebuild and fabricate. The curriculum did not include coil winding. It did not include condenser evaluation by component rather than by substitution. It taught the students to use the test stand as a pass-fail device rather than as a diagnostic instrument. This was not a failure of the schools. It was a rational response to the economics of the industry. Rebuilding was slower and required knowledge that was expensive to acquire and difficult to certify. Replacement was faster and defensible. The economics pointed one direction, and the schools followed the economics. What was lost in this transition was not the ability to put a Magneto on an airplane. That ability remained. What was lost was the ability to understand why a particular Magneto had failed in a particular way, and to address that failure at its root, and to return the component to service with a genuine understanding of its condition. What was lost was the diagnostic language that Delmar had described to Harlan on the porch, the language that lived in the hands and the eyes, and that transferred only through years of working alongside someone who spoke it. When the last speakers retired, the language ended, and when the language ended, the community that had relied on it was left with a replacement economy, more expensive, less precise, and entirely dependent on the continued availability of new parts from manufacturers who made their own decisions about what to continue producing and what to discontinue. Let me tell you about a conversation that Dale Sievert had in 2012 with a young A&P mechanic named Ethan Drummond, who had recently set up an independent shop in Pratt County. Dale had brought a Magneto in for inspection. Nothing wrong with it, just due for a look, and while Drummond was working on it, Dale mentioned Delmar Hassel. Drummond had not heard the name. Dale told him the story. The shop on County Road 14, the $40 rebuilds, the Eisenman G-4, the cracked rotor that Delmar had kept in a bin for 8 years. Drummond listened carefully. When Dale was done, Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did he learn all that?" Dale said he had learned it from his father, who had learned it at Chanute Field during the war. Drummond nodded slowly. He said, "There's nobody teaching that now." Dale said he knew. Drummond said, "I mean, nobody. I've looked." He said he had tried to find resources on Magneto rebuilding, not overhaul, which was documented and proceduralized, but genuine rebuilding, including coil winding and component fabrication, and had found almost nothing current. He had found some old manuals. He had found some references in vintage aviation literature. He had found a few old mechanics at air shows who could talk about it, but who were in their 80s and whose hands were no longer capable of demonstrating it. He said it felt like trying to learn a language from a dictionary after all the native speakers were gone. Dale told him about the coil winding form, the aluminum form that had sold in a box of miscellaneous tooling for $12. Drummond closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that's about right. Let me tell you about Harlan Peterson's Stearman in 2015, because it is the cleanest ending to this part of the story." The Eisenman GV4 that Delmar had rebuilt in 1993, 22 years earlier, finally needed genuine attention. The condenser had begun to show signs of degradation on the test stand, and Harlan, who had maintained his own skills carefully over the years, and who had Delmar's verbal instructions written in a notepad in his logbook drawer, could see that the component needed replacement. He spent 4 months looking for a condenser of the correct specification. He contacted every vintage aviation parts supplier he could find. He contacted the EAA's technical advisors. He contacted 3 different Magnetos shops. Nobody had the part. Nobody could fabricate it. One shop offered to rebuild the Magneto using a modern condenser of approximately correct specification, with the caveat that they could not guarantee timing stability. Harlan declined. He eventually found a condenser in the correct specification in a lot of surplus Magneto parts that a retired mechanic in Nebraska was selling through an online aviation forum. He paid $60 for the lot, which contained the one condenser he needed and 43 others he didn't. He installed it himself, using Delmar's instructions and his own 30 years of experience. The Stearman flew the following summer, but Harlan understood, as he buttoned up the cowling, that he had gotten lucky, that the condenser had been there to find because someone, somewhere, had accumulated it the way Delmar had accumulated things. Not because there was an immediate need, but because the knowledge to recognize its future value had still existed when it was acquired. That supply was finite. It was diminishing, and when it was gone, the Eisenman G54 would become, as 2 shops had told him in 1993, a display piece. Let me tell you one last thing about Delmar Hassel, because the story requires it, and because it is the truest thing in all of this. When Mitch Calloway stood in the empty shop on County Road 14 after the estate sale, looking at the bare walls and the empty bins, he was not just mourning a man. He was standing inside the physical space where a specific kind of knowledge had lived for 60 years, first in Clement's hands, then in Delmar's, and had ended. The shop was not empty because Delmar had died. It was empty because the knowledge had nowhere to go, because the 2 men who had tried to learn it had left for other things, because the economics of the industry had made the rebuilding model obsolete before the knowledge itself was truly exhausted, because the systems that might have preserved it, the schools, the regulatory framework, the industry associations, had all made rational decisions that pointed away from preservation and toward replacement, and those decisions, each individually defensible, had together produced a world in which a cracked distributor block on Dale Sievert's Ag Cat required 4 months and $2,000 to diagnose, and in which an aluminum coil-winding form of irreplaceable utility sold in a box of miscellaneous tooling for $12. Mitch Calloway flew for 3 more years after the estate sale. He retired in 2008, sold his Ag Cat, and moved to a smaller house in St. John. Before he moved, he drove out to County Road 14 one more time and stood at the gate of the property, which had been sold to a neighboring farmer who used the corrugated metal building for equipment storage. The building was full of cultivator shovels and spray nozzles and a grain auger with a bent flight. The wooden workbench was gone. The walls were bare. The fluorescent light that had lit Delmar's work for 40 years was still there, hanging from the ceiling, though it no longer worked. Mitch stood at the gate for a while. He thought about the Tuesday afternoon in October of 1987 when he had driven down this road with a burned Magneto wrapped in a shop rag on his passenger seat, watching $11,000 evaporate. He thought about the way Delmar had said, "Bring it inside," without asking any questions. He thought about coming back Wednesday morning and finding the Magneto sitting on the bench, rebuilt and tested and ready, and the way Delmar had told him the timing setting and the gap specification and what to watch for on the next annual inspection, and then had charged him $40. He thought about 30 other men who had come to this gate with burned Magnetos and gone home with rebuilt ones. He thought about the coil winding form selling for $12 in a box of miscellaneous tooling. He got back in his truck and drove home. Some things don't become obsolete. The knowledge to fix them does. And when that knowledge goes, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hold a closing sale or post a sign on the door. It just stops being available one morning, and the people who needed it find out the hard way. The way Mitch found out in 1999 when he paid $380 for what had once cost $40, and the way Dale found out over 4 months and $2,000, and the way Harlan found out when he spent 6 weeks trying to confirm that a Magneto was fine and needed nothing. The knowledge goes quietly. The bills get larger. The diagnoses take longer. And somewhere in a shop in Nebraska or Kansas or Iowa, an old man with arthritic hands covers his workbench with a canvas tarp and locks the door, and the community that depended on him begins, slowly and without drama, to understand what it